me again. I know you expected me to be there for our practical session today, but some stuff happened that means that I can't. Just to give you a rundown in case you don't already know, my stepdad, who I'm in a bubble with along with my mum because I live on my own, has tested positive for coronavirus at work. He gets tested every day and he got tested positive on Thursday. I've tested negative, and so I haven't got coronavirus, but I've been told to stay at home and work remotely for the next 10 days so that I don't pass anything on to anyone without realising it. So that's what's going to happen, unfortunately. Not what we planned, but it's still going to be fabulous, so don't worry. So last week we started looking at identity, and we were starting to think about what aspects of your identity you wanted to put into your talisman. This week we were meant to be doing heat press transfer printing, but that's quite involved, and also it requires somebody to man the printing press. And so I'm going to postpone that until I'm back so that we can do it properly together. And instead we're going to try a different, more low-tech image transfer technique today, and that's something that I can show you with a video, and you can have James in the session to support you practically to work on that. So on we go. We're still going to work with Lotte Pia Kallio as our inspiration, and she does some image transfer techniques on her souvenir dolls that we had a look at before. One of the ways that we can transfer images onto fabrics or different surfaces by a technique called emulsion printing. And this is because we use emulsion almost as a base and a primer to put our image onto. And it creates this kind of ghostly image using a photocopy. So if you look at the centre image, it's kind of faded and a bit worn. That is because it's an emulsion print, and the very technique, we rub away some layers of paper and it leaves this kind of white ghostly film on the print. And so we're going to try that technique today and hopefully do a bit of experimenting. So first prep task is number 1, of course, it's the first. So you need to take your images that I asked you to source. I gave you this example of my fantabulous Grandad Joe as an example of the kind of image I would get. You need to photocopy the images that you selected from your homes last week and make multiple copies at different scales. So play around with blowing them up quite large, reducing them down quite small, keeping them at the same scale that they already are, so that when we get onto the next stages of experiment and you can start playing around with mixing those up and creating some interesting images, hopefully. So step 1 is to photocopy your images. Prep task 2 is to think about the range of materials that we're going to print onto and see what different effects it creates by using different surfaces. So you can use any porous surface because the emulsion paint needs to soak into it. So we can use wood, MDFs, fabrics, try different fibres, think about different textures. Some will work, some won't. If you've got a really open weave or coarse texture, it often doesn't print very well. It's normally fine, closely woven textures that work well, which is why it also works quite well on wood. Also, you can work on top of other printed papers, so things like magazines work well because they've got a glossy finish, and so they create a contrast in the textures that you can create. So there's some examples here from somebody called Emily Allen, where she's printed onto a map, and she's also printed onto some corrugated paper. So try a whole range of materials. Hopefully you'll have a range to choose from. If not, go rooting around in the fabric store, see what you can find, see what happens. Sometimes things won't work, but that's okay. So after we've gathered all our materials, we've photocopied our image, we need to print our image. The demo, there will be a link in here, it's just slowly uploading onto YouTube. But there is a demo video where I've filmed myself doing it so that you can see the process and see what you need to produce. This is a close-up of the image that I work on the video that shows you in detail the rubbing away part of the paper because it's maybe a bit far away on the video, so it gives you a close-up of what that will look like. So once we've tried our first image transfer and we've got the technique right, we need to start doing some experimenting. This is where we start being artists, we start being creative, we start thinking about what we can communicate with this technique. So I'd like you for task 4 to experiment with your image making. I've given you some ideas to think about, but really anything goes here. So the first thing in orange is about layering images. So there's some examples on here from Emily Allen where she's photocopied some magazines, some newspapers, some photographs, and she's layered those together when she's emulsion printed so that she's got a collaged effect. The second thing in green on the slide is that we can cut and collage images together. We can start to think about whether we take part of our image and merge it with a different part of our image to create a new one. So think about what you want the image to say. Are you wanting to say something about maybe fragmented identity, maybe about merged identities, maybe something about heritage? Think about how you could portray that with the techniques that you choose to use. But remember that all your image needs to be photocopied. It can't just be a newsprint that you put down, it won't print. It needs to be a photocopied image. And then this last thing in purple is hand stitching into the images. So this is a skill that we learned 2 weeks ago when we were hand stitching using split stitch. So the image here from Lotte Pia Callow does that, where she has taken the kind of ghostly image transfer and then started to highlight and delineate some of the shapes with some stitch. So you can start to highlight specific areas of your image, start to add other images on top with stitch. You can start to think about line and fill, think about colour, think about texture contrasts. So that would be a really brilliant thing to start experimenting with. The only thing you need to bear in mind if you're stitching is that your image transfer needs to be dry, so you'll need to hair dry that before you start stitching into it. So the last task after you've finished today is to review what you've done, whack it into whatever contraption you've decided to save all your work in, a sketchbook, a file, a folder, some stapled together papers, whatever you're doing is fine. But I'd like you to send me a photo on Teams of the most exciting thing that you produced today and tell me what ideas it gives you for your identity theme. So I'd like to see the very most interesting, exciting thing that you've produced today and just send it to me on our Teams chat. I'll set up a chat for us and I'll remind you all in the session that you need to do it. So make sure you leave time to do that. I've put some beautiful images of me on here showing you just what I will be doing, waiting for your images, getting closer and closer to my screen until I see them. And then this will be my absolutely beautiful face when you don't send me anything. I want to see what you've done. I want to keep engaged with this project and see what steps you've taken so that I know what we can do next week. So please, please, please show me your stuff and have fun. Enjoy creating stuff that doesn't necessarily have a grading criteria attached to it. You've got more freedom now. Enjoy that.